This module is going to focus on the study of social movements in India. The learning objectives of this module is to acquaint the students to the study of social movements in India, to provide them an idea about the components, the approaches, the definition of social movements, to also expose them to the relationship between the idea of social movements and the state, and finally to also talk about the significance of social movements in general. The study of social movements around the world as well as in India started in the 1960s. This is not to say that there were no social movements before the 1960s, but a concerted effort to focus on a sociological study of social movements began all over the world at a time when the world was beset by a number of social movements. In the 1960s, across the world, we saw the growth of civil rights movement, students' movements, the lesbian and the gay movement, environmental movement, and the peace movements. And correspondingly, in India, we had an outburst of social movements through the Naxalite movement, late 1960s, the women's movement, the environmental movement, and many more. The common understanding of social movements in sociology initially was that these currents of protests were disruptive of social order. Scholars like Neil J. Smeltzer and William Kornhauser, etc., thought of social movements as characteristic of a mass society. Neil J. Smeltzer, in fact, who was a functionalist, spoke of social movements as having a potential to upset the stability, the harmony, the order in society. And therefore, for a long time, social movements were portrayed in a negative fashion. Sociology, which was preoccupied with the idea of social order, thought of any expression of people's protests, people's participation, collective mobilization as a threat to the equanimity of the social. Subsequently, of course, the meaning, approaches, the way of looking at social movements changed, but it took a long time to think of social movements as a harbinger of change in society. Before going on to what social movements have signified, let me define social movements. Social movements are largely seen as a collective or an organized activity to bring about changes in the beliefs, attitudes, thoughts, values, relationships, and major institutions in society. On the contrary, they may also be considered as forces to resist any change in the above societal arrangements. Bloomer saw social movements as collective enterprises to establish a new social order of life. To him, activists of a social movement derive their motivation from dissatisfaction with the current forms of life. At the same time, they draw inspiration from wishes and hopes for a new system of living. Wilkinson defines a social movement as a deliberate collective endeavor to promote change in any direction and by any means, and not excluding violence. Gusfield stressed on the capacity of a social movement to initiate change in some aspect of the social order. Similarly, Heberle thought that they are a collective attempt to bring about a change in certain social institutions or to create entirely a new order. In other words, a social movement is an organized effort to bring about or resist changes in the social order by any means. Before going on to study the components of social movements, let me focus on significant about social movements. Social movements are windows onto a number of aspects of social life that we see around us. They are a main source of political conflict and social change. They are often the first to articulate new political issues and ideas. Secondly, social movements are a central source of social change. Other sources would include formal organizations, corporations who are out to make a profit, or companies which invent new technologies that change our ways of working and interacting. These changes have an impact in the way in which people lead their lives. People react to these changes and resist them by forming social movements. Social movements also signify or reflect a change in values in social arrangements. Further, social movements also develop new ways of seeing the society and new ways of directing it. They are a very important part, in fact, a central part of what is understood as civil society or the public sphere, in which groups and individuals participate and debate their own futures. And hence, if we have a practical interest in democracy or in social change or in documenting ways in which society is changing, the study of social movement is imperative. A knowledge of social movement is very essential. Social movements are also studied by sociologists who have an interest in the moral basis of societies. It is because human beings have moral sensibilities. They have unspoken intuitions as well as articulated principles and rules that guide human action. Social movements are a good way to understand these moral sensibilities that are current in any existing societies. Therefore, social movements play a crucial role in contemporary societies. Most of all, they are one means by which we work out our moral visions, transforming our institutions into principles and political demands. Let me now go on to the elements or components of social movements. A social movement has certain essential and closely related elements. These elements are ideology, collective mobilization, organization, leadership, interest articulation, and identity formation. Ideology may be formulated in different ways. Ideology is also critically debated and closely scrutinized by people who participate in social movements. It is through ideology that a certain process of interest articulation is channelized in social movements. In fact, ideology constitutes a framework. It provides a frame of action for all social movements. Secondly, unless a social movement has public support, there would be no collective mobilization. Therefore, collective mobilization is a central aspect of any social movements. The nature of mobilization largely shapes the nature and direction of a social movement. Collective mobilization may be of different types. They may be violent or non-violent, institutionalized or non-institutionalized. They may be spontaneous or sporadic. But collective mobilization is essential for a social movement to be considered a social movement. A social movement requires leadership and organization to carry out its activities. A leader, whether charismatic or democratic, may play a vital role in guiding a social movement, especially in the initial phase. In fact, a leader helps to translate the ideology for the participants in a social movement. The formation of an organized structure is essential for a social movement because the delineation of roles and responsibilities to different people within a social movement is absolutely essential for taking decisions, for making these decisions effective, and for continuing a social movement. A movement which does not have an effective organization cannot continue for long. But on the other hand, too much of organizational control can also kill the spontaneity of a movement. There is no way to talk about a perfect balance between organization and movement, but this balance between organizational control and the collective mobilization of people can be worked out only by those who are participating in the movement. An important function of the leaders and members of an organization is to articulate an interest in such a way that the concerns of a large section of the participants of the movement are given importance, and the organization remains united because of such common interests. Participants of a movement also build up their specific identity based on a sense of solidarity amongst them and their sympathizers. The growth of a common identity is needed to express unity and oneness of members of the movement. This common oneness of members can be effectively directed against the opponents if there is unity. Formation of sentiments like we versus them are very logical outcomes of any collective mobilizations. Let me now go on to talk about the relationship between social movements and the state. The relationship between social movements and the state is not a very easy or a comfortable one. To explain this statement, one would say that a social movement goes through several phases before it is recognized by the state. Often, the state, which wields power and authority, begins by non-recognizing any social movement. It disregards the participation of people, the collective mobilization, and does not take into consideration or is not willing to recognize the fact that people have certain grievances. Another tactic of the state is to infiltrate the movement. So the state tries to wean away several participants of the movement from its cause to provide information to the state about the goings on inside the social movement. And if a state succeeds to infiltrate a social movement, it often sounds the death knell of a social movement, because the state then tries to intervene in the functioning of the social movements through these co-opted individuals and tries to bring it under control. Apart from non-recognition and infiltration, another typical activity of the state is to reach out or agree to a dialogue or a kind of a negotiation with the movement activists. But the state tries to impose its own terms in order to talk to the members of a social movement. This attempt to reach out to social movements is often at a later stage, after many months of movement organization or collective mobilization has passed. Often the state does not want to come to the table to discuss possible alternatives of solving the problem. But we have seen many times, due to the persistence of the movements and the approach of nonviolence of the participants of the movements, that the state has been forced to initiate a process of dialogue to solve the problem. The recently concluded farmers' movement, which went on for over a year and led to the death of many farmers, was successful because of its nonviolent approach. The state withdrew its ordinances, the 3 farm bills which it had initiated, which would have had an impact on the farming community at large. The state has, in many cases, tries to control social movements by suppressing them. The use of force, the use of violence is not unknown as far as social movements are concerned. This is typically because the state looks upon social movements as disruptive of social order. So, any social movement goes through different stages during which it puts forward its claims to the state, and the state responds to it after a delayed process in either meeting those demands or partially responding to those demands or completely suppressing those demands. So, therefore, I began by saying that the relationship between the state and social movements is not settled or is always uncomfortable. Now, let me go on to discuss why do social movements arise? What are the reasons which causes social movements to emerge in modern society? One of the major causes that has been identified by sociologists is the idea of structural strain. The notion of strain occurs due to, say, for example, raising expectations, relative deprivations, inherent conflicts, collective strain, or psychological imbalances or status inconsistencies, etc. The classical theorists differ about the reasons for structural strain. William Kornhauser, for example, argues that in mass societies, social movements are manifold. This is because people are not integrated in the society. There is an absence of intermediate structure, which leads to alienation, tension, and many kinds of social protests. To them, objective discrepancy between ranking and status of persons lead to subjective tensions in society. As a result, there is a rise in cognitive dissonance, discontentment, and protest. Now, another approach to the study of social movements is given to us by Marxist scholars who attribute importance to structural reasons for explaining conflicts. For them, all varieties of collective mobilization and social movements are a result of class conflict. Social classes are the sole agents of social transformation. In other words, economic or material deprivation is the primary cause of social conflict among the two antagonistic classes, namely the haves and the have-nots. As against the Marxists who saw the rise of class antagonism in a capitalist society, functionalists like Blumer have said that social movements occur because there is a new desire for life. Functionalists also consider social movements as the potential agency of disruptions to the social order. Another approach to the understanding of social movements comes from the theory of relative deprivation. Relative deprivation theorists go a step further to explain the non-material basis of social movements. Thus, according to Eberle, factors such as status, behavior, and prestige are important determinants of deprivation, and a person feels relatively deprived when there is discrepancy between his legitimate expectations and reality. Such deprivation explains social movement to a large extent. Wallace, in his theory of cultural revitalization, has argued that social movements result because members of a society deliberately and consciously in an organized fashion try to build a more satisfying culture for themselves. So, phases like cultural stability, increased individual stress, cultural distortion, and disillusionment have been identified as phases through which social movements undergo transformation. Changes in ideology, organization, leadership, and orientation also introduce new elements in a social movement. Social scientists have observed that social movements many a time become subject to a process of routinization. A protest movement beginning with a radical ideology may develop its own establishment at a later stage. Let me now go on to give you an example of how the role of social movement is important in a democracy. I illustrate this by giving the example of environmental movements. The sociological significance of environmental movements lie in the fact that they lay bare the contradiction at the heart of the capitalist enterprise. Capitalism looks at nature as a resource to be exploited for profit. It regards the human relationship with dependence on nature as secondary and generates conflicts between competing worldviews and orientations. Environmental movements foreground these conflicts and contradictions. Secondly, environmental movements have added a new meaning to democracy and civil society. These movements have been accommodative of a wide plethora of actors and voices, namely tribals, farmers, women, lower class groups, middle class activists, academicians, social scientists, experts, traders, political workers, non-governmental organizations. And because they have been inclusive of these sections of society, we find that active alliances have been forged to influence the decisions and actions of the state, giving meaning to the idea of a democracy. Thirdly, environmental movements, for example, have posed an ideological challenge to the meaning, content, and patterns of development. Sanjay Sangwai has noted that environmental movements have established that along with issues like protection against unjust displacement, employment-oriented decentralized units, food security, housing rights, sustainability, and agricultural industrial policies all are interlinked in a democracy. A few other values that these movements have insisted upon or have reflected is the affirmation to a non-hierarchical mode of functioning and organizing, a focus on forging alternatives, and an increasing emphasis on the small and the local. In the modern society, the relationship between nature and society has become central and complex, and it has wide-ranging implications which are not restricted to any particular society or a class per se. Gunnar Olofsson says that among the new social movements, it is the environmental movement which manages to bring together issues which are at stake personally, along with social issues which affect the reproductive capacity of a society and economy at large. We have traversed a long journey in trying to explain the importance of social movements by dwelling upon the concept of a social movement, the changing understanding of a social movement, the approaches to the study of a social movement, the relationship between social movements and the state, and by demonstrating the role of a social movement in a democracy. The study of social movements is a vast and a significant arena today, especially when the world has traveled through different kinds of crises caused not only by globalization but also by a raging pandemic. Under these circumstances, the importance of social movements cannot be denied, and our attention is drawn on different ways in which people engage in articulating their voices in relation to the state and to the larger society as a whole.